They thought she would be an easy target, just another black woman living alone. What they didn't know was that she was never really alone. The moving truck rolled into the driveway late on a Tuesday morning, a time when most people would be at work or running errands. But not in Roseville, California, where early retirees and home office workers keep an eye on every little movement in the neighborhood. A pair of eyes watched from across the street as the truck came to a stop. 42-year-old Rayshelle Carrington stood by her black SUV, a stack of instructions clutched in her hand, her voice soft but firm as she gave orders to the moving crew. There was no shyness or awkwardness. She moved with the air of a woman who knew who she was and didn't need to prove it to anyone. Skinny jeans, leather boots, a long-sleeved t-shirt with a small coffee stain from breakfast that she hadn't bothered to wipe away. This wasn't a fashion show. This was her new chapter. Her old house, Spanish tile, beige stucco, neatly trimmed hedges, was a testament to her success. But not in the way her old neighbors thought. The first to appear was Douglas Varner, the head of the neighborhood committee. Tall, khaki shorts, golf cap. His handshake was cold and hasty, his eyes flicking past her to focus on the security camera boxes neatly stacked by the front door. "You moved in yourself?" he asked, his tone suspicious of her presence. "Don't we all?" Rayshelle replied, her tone betraying nothing. "Well, if you need anything, we keep things orderly here," Douglas said, his eyes flicking to her SUV before turning away without waiting for a response. The sunset was golden as Rayshelle finished unpacking. The office curtains were hung, and the kitchen was stocked. No signs, no music, no noisy guests. Just a few potted plants on the porch and a folding chair. The next morning, when she opened the door, she found a note neatly laid out under the doormat. All porch decorations must adhere to the rules, flowers only, no religious items or political messages. No name, no signature. Rayshelle chuckled. She hadn't even hung anything yet except a ceramic sun her granddaughter had made in art class. It hung a little crooked, right next to the door. That afternoon, as she bent down to adjust the height of the mailbox, because someone had marked it as inconsistent, she felt eyes on her. A woman in yoga pants was walking her dog. She walked slowly past Rachel's house, and the dog stopped to sniff a corner of the lawn. But the woman's eyes weren't on the dog. She was watching Rayshelle, intently, searchingly, as if trying to figure something out. Rayshelle looked up, met his gaze, and smiled. It wasn't exactly a friendly smile, nor was it exactly a warning. Just a reminder that she knew she was being watched. And she was watching back. The woman smiled brightly, but there was something fake about it. It was forced, like a wax figure molded to create friendliness without warmth. Flowers are very specific, keeping things looking nice. Rayshelle nodded, her eyes lingering on the neatly trimmed flower beds, as if they were not merely ornamental plants, but part of a covert surveillance system. "I read the book." The woman smiled again, this time with even less emotion. "We like our neighborhood in a way." The words were soft, but Rayshelle knew what was behind them. The message was clear: she was an outsider. Someone who didn't belong. They didn't know that she had not only read their pamphlet on community rules, but had pored over top-secret reports that would make a senator sweat. Rayshelle had survived language barriers, explosions, and secret negotiations in windowless rooms in foreign countries. A group of curious residents and a neighborhood association that couldn't shake her. But something was wrong. She had moved to many places, from Times New Town to new cities, and everywhere there were eyes watching. But here, there was a false welcome. Smiles without warmth, gossip mixed with surveillance. So she was prepared. A camera on the front door. Another on the side entrance. 2 more in the corner of the front yard, covering the blind spots. Not because she was paranoid, but because she had learned that being prepared was the key to survival. That night, standing on the porch with a glass of water, she watched quietly. Streetlights flickered in the night breeze. Leaves swirled in the breeze. A car slowly drove by. But as it moved out of her line of sight, it sped up. A familiar sign. Rachel didn't panic. But she didn't feel reassured either. She picked up her disposable phone and sent a quick text to a contact she'd saved under the name Deb's Plumber. The message was brief: operation complete. Logged in. Signs of anomaly. Waiting for flag. No response. She didn't need someone to respond immediately. The important thing was that the information was getting out. The first week passed quietly. But Rachel had a feeling it wouldn't last. By the second week, the tension was building. A note was taped to her mailbox: driveways must be kept clear. Avoid oversized vehicles. Please use garages. Rachel looked at her SUV. It was neatly parked, out of the way, not touching her neighbor's lawn. She peeled off the note, crumpled it up, and tossed it in the recycling bin. The next day, a man she had never seen stood at the edge of her lawn. His arms were crossed, his eyes cold. Rachel watered the succulents outside her window, deliberately ignoring him. But when she looked up, he was still there, not moving, not saying hello. Just looking. "Hello?" she said. No response. Only after a few seconds of silence did he slowly turn and walk away. That night, a second sheet of paper appeared. This time, in all caps. No unauthorized vehicles. Surveillance in action. Street traffic monitoring. Rachel laughed at the irony of it. She scanned the perimeter again. Nothing unusual. But the feeling that someone was watching her grew. She had been in more dangerous situations than this. But this was the first time, in the middle of a seemingly perfect neighborhood, she felt like prey. It was just after 6 o'clock, and the golden sunlight was illuminating the porch of a patrol car. A police car rolled slowly to a stop in front of her house. 2 officers got out, polite but stiff, and approached Rachel. "We've received a call about a disturbance," one of them said, his eyes searching hers. Rachel blinked. "I live alone." "Any visitors tonight?" the officer continued. "You can check to see if they are." They made a few notes and left. But that didn't make Rachel feel any better. 15 minutes later, she saw Douglas Varner again. His khaki shorts were exactly like Walk's. But this time, he wasn't standing in front of the door, but talking to a woman in yoga pants near the mailbox. They both glanced at Rachel as she stepped out onto the porch, and she shivered. Douglas nodded, a neat gesture as if to confirm that everything was under control. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual but tentative. Rachel crossed her arms over her chest. "Fine. You know, the cops come when things don't go according to plan." Douglas raised an eyebrow, as if facing a silent challenge. Then he returned to his conversation. That weekend, the garbage truck completely missed Rachel's house. While the other bins on the street were emptied, hers remained untouched. She called the sanitation department, but they had no record of her missing a pickup. "I know this sounds strange," she said slowly. "But can someone report my house as vacant?" The woman on the other end of the line paused. "Actually, that's what we've got on file." Rachel sighed, her heart tightening. "I live here. We'll fix it." The voice was too mechanical to be comforting. She hung up and sat back on the porch, phone clutched in her hand. That night, the light from a surveillance camera flickered faintly above her. When she checked the back fence, the gate was ajar. Not wide enough for someone to sneak in, but enough to suggest that someone had tried. The lock was still in place, but the chain had fresh scratches, a clear sign of tampering. That was enough. Rachel opened the encrypted tablet she kept in a locked drawer in her home office. Her finger swiped across the screen, triggering a low-level alert. Passive monitoring activated. Detailed access granted in a split second. And at that moment, Karina Bell's name appeared on the screen. Karina lived 2 doors down, a retired woman who loved begonias and would rather talk about her aching knees than politics. But no one in Briar Hollow knew that she had once worked in international security logistics. A secret assignment from Langley years ago. And Karina owed Rachel a favor. The next morning, before Rachel could even make coffee, there was a knock on the door. Karina stood there, a basket of muffins in her hands, her eyes delicate but sharp. "We have something to discuss, young lady." The second man stepped forward. "We need you to step outside. We want to walk you through the violations." "No thanks." The first man's smile faded. "Look, we're just trying to help you avoid a fine. This could escalate." Rachel tilted her head, her eyes sharp. "I doubt it." They exchanged glances. And then, without warning, they moved. One lunged forward, trying to grab her arm. The other reached for the door. Karina was on her feet before they could touch Rachel. "Back," she said, her voice razor sharp. She moved abruptly, precisely, a motion that didn't belong to a retiree. The phone was in her hand, her thumb flicking across the screen in a precise sequence of actions that wasn't 911 but could have been worse for them. "Who are you?" Her voice was low but commanding. One of them took a step back. The other yanked the door open. Rachel didn't move. She didn't scream. She didn't struggle. She just twisted, and hit him hard on the wrist. He let go immediately, pain shooting through his hand. The air was thick. Rachel and Karina looked at the two men as if they were cornered animals. "I think this conversation ends here," Rachel said, her voice calm. Karina held her position, her eyes fixed on them. They considered. A second. 2 seconds. Then, without a word, they turned and hurried back to the car. The door slammed shut, a sharp sound in the quiet afternoon. Karina sighed, returned to her seat, picked up her teacup. "This will continue." Rachel closed the door, turned back to her friend. "Let them try." Rachel grabbed his thumb, quickly tucked it into the crook of her arm, and bent it in a perfect, smooth escape, as if it had been drilled into her subconscious by years of practice. The cursed man staggered back, a strangled groan escaping his throat. "They're not ready for that," Rachel said softly, her voice low enough to be a whisper on the wind. The second man recovered, charging forward again with a senseless fury, but this time. The sound of tires crunching gravel. Not too loud, but enough to freeze all three of them. 2 dark SUVs turned onto the deserted street. No sirens. No flashing lights. No lines. Just a slow, calm presence that was terrifying. The men glanced at each other, calculating. "You can run," Rachel said, "but it'll be worse." No one moved. One gasped, the other tried to keep his composure, but his eyes said it all. Within seconds, both SUVs came to a stop. The doors opened. 4 individuals stepped out, 2 from each vehicle. They were dressed in civilian clothes, sunglasses covering half their faces, no weapons visible, but their movements were synchronized, as efficient as a sophisticated machine. The man with the phone tried to run. He only made it 6 steps before falling flat on his face, his arm twisted behind his back. The phone flew off, skidding across the sidewalk. The other didn't even try. He just sat down on the porch steps, as if someone had drained all the energy out of him. His arrogant confidence evaporated in an instant. One of the agents, a thin man with graying hair, turned to Rachel. "Miss Carrington, are you okay?" She nodded. "Minimal contact, no injuries. Cameras caught everything." "Good." He nodded, then turned to Karina. "Thanks for pinging." "Just the right timing," Karina shrugged. Within 10 minutes, the 2 men were handcuffed, sitting on the sidewalk like children being punished. Neighbors began peeking through their blinds. A few garage doors were open, silhouettes watching silently from a distance, pretending to do mundane things like sweeping the yard. But no one stepped forward. Not even Douglas Varner. The taller of the two arrested finally spoke. "We just want to make sure the neighborhood is safe." Rayshelle raised an eyebrow. "Safe from what?" He didn't answer, but the look in the direction of Douglas Varner's house said it all. Rayshelle wasn't the only one who noticed. The agents, and Karina, who stood on the porch with her arms crossed, her eyes sharp as if she were watching a lit-up chessboard. One of the agents, a woman in her 30s with a thick New Jersey accent, caught the look. She nodded once to her partner and walked slowly down the sidewalk toward the Douglases' door. There was a knock. No response. A few minutes later, the female agent radioed the backup team. No sirens. Just unmarked cars creeping up, clean, cool, efficient. By now, several neighbors had stepped out into the street. They huddled around mailboxes, whispering to each other. Unable to take their eyes off the house, which was silent like an unsolved mystery. No one dared to approach the house. Rayshelle sat there, silent on the porch, her eyes fixed on the empty space ahead. Night had fallen, the yellow lights illuminating the shadowy figures of the moving federal agents. Karina stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the porch, watching the show unfold before them. "He was never that smart," she muttered. "You know him?" Rayshelle asked, not turning around. "Not personally, but I've been watching his cameras for weeks." Rayshelle raised an eyebrow. "This thing he calls wildlife research?" Karina smiled faintly, a smile laced with contempt. "Funny, wildlife always looks like women walking dogs or brown kids riding bikes." The man, Gregory Melman, his real name, had a criminal record for impersonating a police officer in Arizona. And now he was being bundled into one of the sleek black SUVs parked in front of the house. Beside him, Ronan Kessler, another ghost of the neighborhood, one with a sealed juvenile record who lived just outside the city limits. Neither of them were residents, just puppets in a much larger game. One of the agents returned, crouching down to Rachel's eye level. "We're collecting surveillance footage right now. The neighbor across the street from you has cameras. We've got access through the city's control. You think he's involved?" Rayshelle asked, her voice calm but sharp. "I think whoever's pulling this off believes you're an easy target." Rayshelle glanced toward the house across the street. The Douglas front windows were shuttered. She wasn't surprised. That was the nature of men like him, always wanting to be in control but never wanting to be seen. "You know what's really wild?" The agent chuckled. "HOA scams, fraudulent residents, shadowy contractors, they're more common than you think. But this time, they picked the wrong guy." Karina curled her lip. "Definitely." An hour later, with the Fed's evidence in hand, they knocked on Douglas's door. This time, he couldn't ignore it. Rayshelle didn't hear the rest of the conversation, but she saw the look in his eyes. The moment he realized this wasn't a neighborhood game anymore, it was a federal investigation. The suspicious payments, the anonymous calls about fake violations, the fabricated reports to maintain the illusion of control, they all led back to him. He tried to deny it, saying he just wanted to keep the neighborhood in order, but that was never the real reason. It wasn't the porch or the misplaced SUVs. The problem was someone like Rayshelle Carrington, someone who didn't need anyone's approval. She didn't play by their rules, and that scared them. Everything was now documented, calculated, and cross-referenced. The agents had enough evidence to turn the tables. On the porch, Karina leaned toward Rayshelle. "Are you okay?" Rayshelle nodded. "Okay. But I'm tired of this script." Karina smiled half-heartedly. "Then maybe it's time we rewrite it." That night, the news spread like wildfire. 2 arrests, a formal federal investigation, and a long list of neighbors summoned for interviews. But no one, had the nerve to ask Rayshelle why she'd reacted so quickly, or why the tactical agents had shown up in less than 10 minutes. They had the answer. They just didn't want to admit it, they didn't know. They didn't know about the land clearing, about the invisible deaths, about the watchful eyes that had been lurking in the shadows for the past 5 weeks. Most importantly, they didn't know who they'd offended. What had seemed like a quiet cleanup had become the center of attention, and now no one could pretend not to see the truth lurking beneath the surface. The next morning, the neighborhood was in turmoil. You didn't have to look to feel it, in the way garage doors slammed shut, in the hurried footsteps of early morning joggers who skipped their usual greetings. Even the couple who chatted on the street corner stood farther apart than usual. The familiar rhythm of life was disrupted, and everyone knew why. Rachel sat on the porch, a warm cup of coffee between her hands. She crossed her legs, her eyes following the street, which was filled with an unnamed tension. No music, no books, just a quiet, sharp observation. She had lived under surveillance, in places where smiling at the wrong person could get her arrested. But in Roseville, the game was run differently, under the guise of community values, under the guise of safety concerns. Karina appeared, walking steadily through the pale morning light. She carried a file under her arm, saying nothing until she sat down next to Rachel. They dug deeper than I thought. Her voice was low. I found 3 other devices near your yard. Rachel blinked. Hidden in sprinklers. Karina nodded. They planted worse. Motion sensors, thermal cameras, microphones hidden in the reeds. Someone was collecting evidence for something. Or, just pretending. Across the street, a curtain fluttered. Leanne Price, the older woman, was staring through the lace. This time, she didn't flinch when their eyes met. She was the one who had called the police on Rachel. Twice. She's not hiding it anymore, Rachel muttered. Karina didn't ask how she knew. That afternoon, a federal vehicle rolled quietly into the neighborhood, this time carrying official documents. The investigation had widened. Douglas Varner's finances had been exposed, and with them a secret payment network for private security, an organization called Civic Harmony Consultants LLC. They weren't just falsifying information, they were part of a hidden network, designed to intimidate and control. It wasn't new. It wasn't even that well hidden. It had just never been challenged, until now. When there was a real federal file attached, things got serious. At the end of the day, a representative from the community board arrived, his face ashen. Marisol Dupree, a small woman with a trembling notebook in her hand. We don't know, the phrase repeated itself 3 times before she realized it was no longer effective. Rachel took a sip of coffee, looking at her calmly. Douglas told me you knew. Marisol lowered her head, silent. Don't apologize. Rachel's voice turned cold. Be transparent. Tell everyone what happened. Marisol pursed her lips. We will. As she left, standing at the foot of the porch stairs, Rachel knew the game had changed. And this time, she wasn't the only one who saw it. Rachel took a deep breath before answering, her voice low but determined. I couldn't keep my cool. Her words didn't stop there. They spread far and wide, faster than a flame in the wind. That weekend, a local news van pulled up at the end of the street. The reporters didn't approach, didn't ask questions, just quietly recorded from a distance. Only when federal agents asked them to leave did they reluctantly pack up their equipment. But that didn't matter. The story had spread, spreading like oil on water. A clip from a neighbor's camera began to appear online. It showed a fake name, an unofficial badge, screams echoing off quiet walls, and a dramatic confrontation. As the clip spread across social media, it sparked outrage not just because of what had happened to Rachel, but because it was so familiar. Painful memories flooded back in the comments. This happened to my dad in Austin. Same story in Phoenix, except that time the police backed them up. People understood. They saw clearly how the code was being used as a weapon. It wasn't just a single story, it was a pattern, a cycle of injustice that repeated itself over and over again. The quiet streets of Roseville were suddenly a hot topic, not because of the manicured lawns or the top-rated schools, but because of what happens when private power believes it can act with impunity. That night, Karina stepped out onto the porch with 2 glasses of wine. The sky was dark, the porch light casting flickering shadows. She looked at Rayshelle intently. "Are you thinking about moving?" Rayshelle shook her head, her eyes fixed on the space in front of her. "Not yet." Karina nodded. Without many words, they both understood that some changes were irreversible. It wasn't just the change in the neighborhood or the way others saw them. It was the change in Rayshelle herself. She saw it, with absolute clarity. And she knew that silence would only create space for it to continue. A timely response could close that door forever. 2 days later, a closed-door meeting was held in an unmarked building near the Sacramento Municipal Complex. There were no newspapers. No sensational headlines. Just a small room with a table, 4 chairs, and 3 people who knew how the world really worked. Rayshelle sat at the end of the table, dressed in a simple black suit. In front of her was a stack of manila documents. Across from her was Colin Braddock, the lead investigator on the federal investigation into civic harmony. To his left was a DHS cybersecurity agent, his face cold and unreadable. Karina sat to Rachel's right, calm as ever. Braddock looked at Rayshelle, his voice calm but serious. "What you're dealing with isn't just a small group in this neighborhood. The ones you flagged operate in several western states." Rayshelle nodded. She knew. She'd seen how they operated. They preyed on retirement communities, gated communities, places where community responsibility lagged and peace was easy to manipulate. They didn't just use fake authority, they weaponized it. Targeting anyone who didn't fit the mold, anyone with out-of-state license plates, anyone who looked different or simply kept quiet. Braddock slid a tablet toward her. They did more than impersonate authority. Rayshelle looked down at the screen. Her eyes narrowed. A slow fire burned inside her. Karina sat up straight, her eyes sharp as she watched the data stream across the screen in front of her. She looked up, her gaze meeting Braddock's. "They're gathering intelligence." The DHS representative glanced up, her gaze sweeping across the glass wall that reflected the pale yellow light from the streetlights outside. "Your house has a passive thermal tag. It's not HRHO, but it's still military-grade surplus technology." Braddock leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "This is the part you won't like." He slid a folder toward Rayshelle. "There's a notification marked 6 months ago. One of our back channels picked it up, but it wasn't prioritized." Rayshelle took the folder, flipping to the first page. It was a printout of an encrypted email chain. The subject line stood out: "New residents, background check, CIA link." She read silently, a chill running down her spine. "Someone was following me before I even closed the deposit." Braddock nodded. "We believe so. They don't know exactly who you are, but they know enough to be concerned. That's why the harassment started almost immediately. They're testing the boundaries." Rayshelle clenched the file. "And if I push back too hard?" "They claim you're the problem," Braddock replied. "That's their pattern. They provoke until the target reacts, then they escalate. They create enough of a paper trail to make you look unstable." Karina spoke up, her voice cold. "They messed with the wrong person this time." Braddock chuckled. "That's what we're hearing." He paused, his eyes thoughtful. "But it's not personal anymore." "It never was." Rayshelle nodded. "It's not a neighborhood brawl. It's part of a system. A system that relies on silent compliance." After the meeting, as they walked out into the parking lot, Karina broke the silence. "How long do you think it'll last this time?" Rayshelle looked at the darkness that was slowly enveloping the street. "There's a price to pay in exposure. They'll try to cover it up, but this time, someone's watching. It's not invisible anymore." Back home that evening, Rayshelle opened her closet and pulled out a dusty photo album. The yellowed pages were filled with forgotten memories. The pictures were from old assignments, some of them blurry, others clipped from foreign newspapers. But among the memories, there was another photo that caught her eye. Her mother, standing in front of her old house in Paterson, New Jersey. The woman had fought back, quietly but relentlessly, when a dishonest neighbor tried to evict them with baseless accusations. And she had won. The fire was still burning. At dusk, Rachel stepped out onto the porch. This time, she was not alone. The neighbors, who had avoided her all this time, were standing nearby. A few were walking their dogs. Another was watering her plants. A man across the street waved a greeting. She folded her arms, staring at the cul-de-sac ahead. She could see clearly now. "I used to think I could buy peace," she said loudly. Karina, not taking her eyes off her phone, replied. "You still can. It just costs more than most people expect." They stood there, in silence. Inside, the cameras were still recording. Not because Rachel expected another attack, but because now, documentation was part of survival. Rachel knew better than anyone that endings didn't mean victory. An arrest or a scandal didn't mean everything. True victory was not letting yourself shrink, not letting fear hold you back. A week later, the neighborhood was back to its usual rhythm. The lawn crews were back, the kids were back on their bikes on the trails. But not for everyone. There was an invisible shift in the air, a new kind of awareness, especially when people passed the Carrington house. Some waved, others avoided eye contact altogether. Some even looked like they wanted to apologize, but didn't know how. Rachel didn't wait for them to find out. She spent her mornings in her home office, her evenings catching up with the garden she'd barely touched since moving in. She walked the neighborhood, not because she had to, but because she could. Power wasn't just about protection. It was about presence. One evening, Karina showed up at the door with a folding chair and a cold bottle of mineral water. "I thought I'd be your friend," she said. They sat in silence, watching the sky turn a pale orange. "I thought," Karina said, "why would they do that? They don't know who you are. But they don't seem to care." Rachel chuckled, her voice quiet. "They just assumed I wouldn't fight back." Karina nodded. "Because most people don't. Because most people can't." They let the words hang in the air, understanding each other without further words. Not everyone had a federal contact on speed dial. Not everyone had decades of tactical training. And not everyone had a Karina 2 doors down. But what had happened in Roseville was more than favoritism or intimidation. It was a structure, a system that made it easy for people to become gatekeepers behind a facade of false authority, false concern, false smiles. But that system only worked until someone dared to break the script. That night, Rachel sat down at her desk and wrote a letter. Not to HOA, not to her neighbor, but to a young girl she had never met, someone who would have to face a version of this story in the future. Don't wait for permission. Take your space. Be quiet if you can, be loud if you have to. They will test you, but they always misjudge what they don't understand. Keep the evidence. Stay calm. And most importantly, always make yourself visible. Even if they want you to be invisible. Rachel folded the letter, tucked it into her diary, and placed it on the shelf next to her old badge. Not as a trophy, not as a souvenir, but as a reminder. Because this isn't just about a porch, or a fence, or a set of neighborhood rules. This is about how far people will go to protect their illusions. And how quickly those illusions can crumble when someone stands up and refuses to back down. The following Sunday, a community announcement was made at the town meeting about restoring trust and transparency in local law enforcement. Douglas Varnell's name was removed from all HOA records, without any formal explanation. No one had invited Rachel, but she showed up anyway. She sat in the back row, listening silently. Not just with her ears, but with her senses. The nervous coughs. The careful choice of words. The shifts in posture when someone realized she was in the room. After the meeting, Leanne Price stepped in front of her. "I didn't know it was that serious. We just thought something was wrong." Rachel tilted her head. "What kind of wrong?" Leanne hesitated. "I didn't expect you to be so prepared." Rachel looked at her. "I didn't expect to have to do this either." They stood there for a brief moment, then Leanne nodded and walked away. It wasn't a reconciliation. But perhaps it was the beginning of a reckoning. That night, Rachel posted a single sentence on her rarely used social media account: "Politeness won't save you. Preparation will." Within days, it had gone viral. Because people were no longer watching this story as just a movie. They were starting to see the pattern. And maybe, just maybe, they knew it was time to break it. So if you've read this far, remember, power isn't always confrontation. Sometimes it's a chair on the porch. A camera at the right angle. A voice that refuses to be silenced. And if this story means something to you, please share it. Because someone out there needs to hear it, too.